Ithara Prime was a city that wore its sins openly. Its sprawling streets writhed with life, every corner a testament to desperation, excess, and under the garish glow of countless neon signs, beings from every corner of the galaxy milled about, their movements a cacophony of purpose and chaos. The air tasted metallic, thick with industrial residue and the acrid smoke. Kale Varen moved like a ghost through the throng, his every step deliberate. His cloak, a dull shade of gray, hung loose enough to obscure his form, but not so much that it drew suspicion. The people of Ithara Prime didn't trust strangers, and Kyle intended to remain invisible for as long as possible. His gaze darted over the crowd. Traders hawked wares ranging from exotic fruits that pulsed faintly with light to black market tech, too dangerous for any sanctioned system. A pair of enforcers, hulking brutes clad in dark armor, loomed near an alley, their faces hidden behind visors that reflected the city's omnipresent neon. Their presence was a silent reminder. Ithara Prime was a haven for anyone willing to pay the right bribes, but mercy cost extra. Kale's destination loomed ahead. The gates of the slave auction stood tall and ornate, their crimson banners fluttering against a polluted sky. The material shimmered unnaturally, catching the light like liquid fire. It was meant to dazzle, to create an air of prestige around an enterprise built on suffering. He stopped just short of the entrance, his stomach nodding as he surveyed the crowd. Merchants, aristocrats, and mercenaries, each with a hungry look in their eyes, filed into the hall. Kyle's fingers brushed against the comm tucked at his side, its faint hum grounding him. He reminded himself why he was here. A name, a purpose. Aaron Thalora. Inside, the auction hall stretched wide and circular, the seating tiers rising like a coliseum of old earth. At its center, the stage glowed beneath harsh spotlights, casting stark shadows on the faces of those paraded across it. Aaron wasn't here yet, but Kyle knew she would be. She was the headliner, the spectacle. The announcer, a reptilian creature whose jeweled scales reflected every color of the spectrum, moved theatrically across the stage. His voice, deep and melodic, echoed through the chamber as he introduced each asset. His claws clicked against the floor with every exaggerated step. Kale scanned the crowd. Most sat with an air of leisure, but their eyes betrayed them. They weren't here to browse. They were predators sizing up their prey. A merchant in a flowing robe leaned forward, whispering eagerly to a companion. A mercenary at the back rested his hand on the hilt of his plasma blade, his predatory gaze fixed on the stage. The announcer's voice rose. And now, esteemed guests, the moment you've all been waiting for, the jewel of tonight's offerings. A warrior from the Thalora lineage, a marvel of strength, discipline, and combat perfection. Behold, a murmur rippled through the crowd as a figure emerged onto the stage. Erin moved with a grace that defied the weight of her chains. Her skin, a deep, lustrous shade of violet, gleamed under the spotlights. Silver tattoos spiraled up her arms and neck, their designs intricate and flowing, marking her as a warrior of her clan. Even bound, her presence was undeniable. Her eyes, a molten amber, scanned the crowd with disdain, daring anyone to meet her gaze. She didn't look afraid, though Kale knew better. Fear wasn't an absence of courage. It was the resistance to it. The announcer circled her like a predator toying with its kill. A genetic masterpiece, he purred. Enhanced reflexes, unparalleled strength, and a combat record that speaks for itself. Undefeated in the gladiatorial pits of Zenthar. Starting bid, 50,000 credits. The first bid came almost instantly. 60,000. 70. The numbers climbed. Each shouted offer pushing Kyle closer to the edge of failure. His fingers flexed, his pulse quickening. He'd come too far to leave without her. 90,000. Kale raised his hand, his voice steady. 100,000 credits. A hush fell over the room. Heads turned, murmurs spreading like wildfire. The announcer's slitted eyes gleamed with amusement and greed. A bold offer. Do I hear 110? The crowd fell silent. 100,000 credits was an extravagant sum, enough to buy a fleet of workers or a heavily armed mercenary squad. To spend it on one slave was either madness or a statement of power. Sold, the announcer declared, his grin revealing rows of sharp teeth. To the gentleman in the Cale allowed himself a brief exhale, but the tension in his chest didn't ease. The real danger was just beginning. Erin stood in the holding area, her wrists and ankles still bound by heavy durasteel cuffs. Up close, her defiance was even more striking. Despite the bruises shadowing her cheekbones and the grime caked onto her skin, she held herself like a queen. Cale approached slowly, his movements deliberate. She didn't flinch, but her amber eyes narrowed, calculating. "So," she said, her voice cool and sharp, "what kind of buyer are you? Looking for a bodyguard? A fighter for some private arena? Or is this about something?" Her tone turned venomous, and Kyle realized she was testing him, probing for weaknesses. "I'm not here to own you," he said simply. Her laugh was harsh, bitter. "Is that what you tell yourself? That you're different? You paid for me like the rest of them?" Kale leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I paid to get you out of here. You'll understand once we're off this rock." Erin's eyes flicked to his hands, to the blaster concealed beneath his cloak. "And if I refuse to go, then you'll die here," Kale said bluntly. "But I don't think you're ready to give up. Not yet." Before she could respond, alarms blared. Kale's fake credit chit had been discovered. Shouts erupted, and the heavy stomp of boots echoed through the corridor. Kale's jaw tightened. He grabbed a small device from his belt, a lock disruptor. "Hold out your wrists." Erin hesitated. "Now," he barked. Reluctantly, she held out her hands. The disruptor buzzed, and the cuffs fell away. Erin flexed her fingers, her amber eyes never leaving Kyle. "You better have a plan," she said, her tone icy. Kale smirked grimly. "Follow me if you want to live." They sprinted down the corridor, the shouts behind them growing louder. Kyle led her through a side exit into a maintenance shaft, its dim light casting jagged shadows on the walls. "Where are we going?" Erin demanded. "My ship," he replied. "It's not much, but it'll get us out of here." "And then what?" "Then you're free," Kyle said. "No strings, no chains." Erin slowed, her expression a mix of skepticism and confusion. Kale glanced back at her, his voice softer this time. "Because I couldn't save someone else, someone who deserved freedom as much as you." Her eyes searched his face, but whatever answer she sought, she didn't find. Instead, she squared her shoulders, her gaze hardening. "Let's move," she said. Kale didn't argue. For now, survival was enough. The rest could wait. The Starseeker cut through the void like a battered arrow, its engines humming with a laborious rhythm that spoke of age and overuse. Kyle Varen adjusted the flight controls with steady hands, his eyes scanning the navigation display. The ship was stable, for now. But he knew better than to trust the fragile calm. Ythera Prime's security drones wouldn't take long to notice their unregistered departure, and the asteroid belt they'd soon cross would provide only fleeting. In the dim light of the cockpit, Kyle's face was drawn, shadows deepening the weariness etched into his features. He didn't dare glance back toward the cargo hold where Erin Thalora waited. Waited wasn't the right word. She was watching, dissecting his every move, her suspicion practically crackling in the stale air. He stole a glance at the security monitor. She sat in a corner of the hold, her broad shoulders tense and her amber eyes sharp as a blade. She'd yet to say much since they escaped the slave auction. Kyle doubted that was a good sign. The Starseeker lurched as a distant gravitational field tugged at its hull. The sudden jolt made Kale grit his teeth. The ship might hold together for now, but it wasn't built for combat or prolonged evasion. It had survived this long because Kyle knew its limits. And "Your ship always sound this." "Unstable?" Erin's voice cut through the quiet low and edged with sarcasm. Kale flicked a few switches on the console, keeping his tone neutral. "She's old but reliable, gets the job done." Barely. Erin leaned against the wall of the cargo hold, her violet skin gleaming faintly in the low light. The silver tattoos etched across her arms caught the glow, their patterns shifting as she moved. "If this is your idea of a rescue, I've had better offers." Kale turned to face her, leaning against the edge of the console. "You're free now. I'd say that's a decent start. Her laugh was sharp, humorless. Free? I'm stuck on this rust bucket with a stranger who thinks buying me means he can play hero. Tell me, Kyle Varen, what's the catch? There's no catch, he said evenly. You're not a prisoner here. Her eyes narrowed, the intensity of her gaze making him feel like prey under a predator's scrutiny. I've heard that before. It's never true. Kale sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I'm not trying to own you, Aaron. I got you out of there because someone had to. Why me? She pressed, her voice cutting through his defenses. You could have walked past that auction and ignored it like everyone else. Kale hesitated. He didn't want to tell her, didn't want to open the door to memories he worked so hard to keep buried. But her amber eyes pinned him in place, demanding an answer. I had a sister, he admitted finally, his voice low. Nia, she was taken by slavers when we were kids. I couldn't stop it, and I never saw her again. I'm not letting that happen to someone else, not if I can help it. Erin tilted her head, her expression unreadable. And you think saving me makes up for that? No, Kyle said firmly. But it's a start. For a moment, silence hung between them. Then, with a dismissive shrug, Erin turned her gaze to the viewport. You'll need more than good intentions to keep me alive, Kyle. Before he could respond, the ship's proximity alarm blared, a shrill sound that sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. Kale snapped back to the console, his fingers flying across the controls. What now? Erin asked, her tone sharp. Trouble, Kyle muttered. The navigation screen showed 3 ships closing in fast, their signatures unmistakable. Pirates. Erin moved to stand behind him, her presence commanding even in the cramped cockpit. How many? 3, small ships, but faster than us. Kyle clenched his jaw, and I know who's leading them. Care to share? Threx Malik, Kyle said grimly, an old acquaintance. Smuggler, mercenary, and a general pain in the ass. The comm crackled to life, and a familiar voice filled the cabin. Kyle Varen, fancy meeting you out here. You've got a knack for stirring up trouble. Kale's hand hovered over the comm switch. Threx? The voice on the other end carried a mocking lilt. I hear you've picked up a valuable passenger. Hand her over, and I might let you limp away with your precious ship. Kale muted the comm and glanced at Erin. Her expression darkened, her jaw tightening. He was obviously. She crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. Then let's give him something else to think about. Kale turned back to the controls. He's got 3 ships. We've got this. You got a plan? I fight, Erin said simply. You fly. Not exactly inspiring, Kyle muttered, though he couldn't deny the flicker of admiration for her confidence. The first blast rocked the Starseeker, sparks flying from the control panels. Kyle wrestled the ship into a sharp dive, narrowly avoiding another barrage. The shields were already failing. Shields down to 20%, Kale said through gritted teeth. Erin grabbed the edge of the console, steadying herself. This thing have any weapons? 2 aging blasters and a missile system that hasn't worked since I bought the ship. Right, she scanned the cockpit, her eyes landing on the escape pod hatch. Then we improvise. Kale glanced at her sharply. What are you thinking? Get me close enough to one of those ships, Erin said, strapping herself into the escape pod's harness. I'll take it from there. That's insane. Do you have a better idea? Kale opened his mouth, then closed it. He didn't. With a muttered curse, he activated the pod's launch sequence. You better come back. Erin grinned, her defiance blazing. I'm not dying in chains, Kale. The pod launched with a hiss, streaking toward the nearest pirate ship. Kyle watched as it slammed into the hull, embedding itself with a jarring impact. Moments later, the pirate ship veered off course, its systems scrambling. Inside the pod, Erin moved with lethal precision. She tore through the hatch and into the pirate ship, her fists and feet a blur of motion. The pirates were unprepared for her ferocity. She fought like a storm, her violet skin streaked with blood and sweat as she dismantled her enemies. Kale seized the distraction, turning the Starseeker toward the remaining 2 ships. He fired the blasters, striking one vessel's engines and sending it spiraling into the asteroid field. The last ship hesitated, then turned tail and fled. The comm crackled again, Threx's voice no longer mocking. Call her off, Kyle. Whatever you want, it's yours. Kale smirked. Too late for that, Threx. Erin returned minutes later, piloting the hijacked pirate ship with ease. She docked with the Starseeker, her expression grim but triumphant. Kale met her at the airlock, his arms crossed. Remind me never to argue with you. Erin stepped onto the deck, her amber eyes gleaming. Smart man. For the first time, Kale felt a flicker of hope. She was dangerous, unpredictable, and entirely her own person. But maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. Together, the Starseeker limped through the stars, its engines emitting a low, rhythmic groan. The damage sustained during the pirate skirmish had left Kyle's ship hanging together by little more than determination and patchwork repairs. The smell of burnt circuitry lingered in the cabin, a sharp reminder of their narrow escape. Kyle glanced at the control panel, where flashing red lights warned of systems on the brink of failure. We need to land, he said, his tone clipped. Land where? Erin's voice cut through the tense quiet. She stood behind him, her arms crossed and her amber eyes sharp as ever. We're not exactly surrounded by luxury resorts. Kale flicked a switch on the console, pulling up the star map. There's a planet a few clicks from here, uninhabited. Atmosphere's rough but survivable. We can make repairs there. And if we can't? She asked. Kale met her gaze. Then we'll find another way. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. She had no reason to trust him, but Kyle didn't have the luxury of time to win her over. The Starseeker shuddered again, as if emphasizing his point. Strap in, Kale said, engaging the thrusters. This landing won't be smooth. The planet's surface rose up to meet them, a jagged wasteland of rock and ash. The sky churned with storms, streaks of crimson lightning illuminating the horizon. The Starseeker skidded across the ground before coming to a halt, its landing gear buckling under the... Kale released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Well, he muttered, we're alive. Erin unbuckled her harness, her movements sharp and deliberate. Alive doesn't mean safe. Kale glanced out the viewport. The terrain was hostile, barren of any sign of life. Massive rock formations jutted into the sky, their sharp edges silhouetted against the stormy backdrop. The air was heavy with dust, and Kyle's instruments indicated high levels of toxicity. We'll need masks, he said, already moving to the supply locker. Erin watched him, her expression unreadable. Do you always plan for crashes? Comes with the job, Kale replied, tossing her a breathing mask. I've learned to expect the worst. She caught the mask effortlessly, her movements fluid and controlled. Optimistic. Kale didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he grabbed a toolkit and opened the airlock. Let's get to work. Outside, the air was suffocating, even with the masks filtering out the worst of the toxins. The ground crunched beneath their boots, the ash giving way to hard stone. The Starseeker loomed behind them, its hull scarred and smoking. Kale crouched near the landing gear, inspecting the damage. This isn't just wear and tear, he said, his voice muffled through the mask. Threx's ships hit us harder than I thought. Erin stood a few feet away, her eyes scanning the horizon. We're exposed out here. If he tracks us, we're sitting targets. He won't, Kyle said, though he wasn't sure. Not without a trail. And if he does? Erin turned to him, her gaze piercing. Kale straightened, meeting her eyes. Then we fight. Erin's lips quirked into the barest hint of a smile. Finally, something we agree on. Hours passed in grueling silence as they worked to stabilize the ship. Cal focused on patching the damaged systems, his hands steady despite the fatigue weighing him down. Erin moved with precision, her strength proving invaluable as she helped lift debris and secure parts of the ship's structure. You've done this before, Kyle said, watching her effortlessly hoist a heavy panel. I've done a lot of things, she replied, not elaborating. Kale decided not to press. He didn't need her life story, just her cooperation. As the twin suns dipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeted. The wind picked up, howling through the jagged rocks and carrying with it a biting chill. Kyle adjusted his mask, his breath visible in the frigid air. We should stop, he said, his voice hoarse. Rest and start again in the morning. Erin's gaze flicked toward the ship, then back to the endless expanse of desolation. You rest. I'll keep watch. Kale frowned. You don't trust me to pull my weight? I don't trust anything on this planet, she said, including you. He wanted to argue, but he saw the resolve in her eyes. Instead, he nodded and headed back. Kale woke to the sound of distant thunder. He sat up quickly, his heart pounding. Aaron stood by the viewport, her posture tense. What is it? He asked, moving to her side. Something's out there, she said quietly. Kyle followed her gaze. At first, he saw nothing but the jagged rocks and swirling storms. Then, a flash of movement caught his eye. Shapes darted between the shadows, low to the ground, fast and unsettlingly quiet. What are they? Kale whispered. Hunters, Aaron said grimly. Probably native to the planet. Can we scare them off? Doubtful, she replied. They're not scavengers, they're predators. The ship shuddered as something slammed into the hull. Kyle cursed, grabbing his blaster. Stay inside. Don't be stupid, Aaron snapped. She grabbed a weapon from the supply locker and shoved it into his hands. We deal with this together. The first creature appeared at the edge of the clearing, its sleek, sinewy form illuminated by the ship's external lights. Its skin shimmered, blending seamlessly with the rocks around it. Sharp, glistening teeth protruded from its maw, and its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. Kale raised his blaster, his hand steady despite the fear coiling in his chest. What's the plan? Don't die, Aaron said, stepping forward. The creature lunged, and Aaron met it head-on, her movements a blur. She sidestepped its attack, bringing the butt of her weapon down hard on its head. The creature snarled, reeling back, but Aaron didn't give it a chance to recover. She drove her blade into its side, a precise and brutal strike. Kyle fired at a second creature as it charged toward him, the blaster bolt hitting its mark. The creature crumpled, but more appeared, their glowing eyes multiplying in the darkness. We're outnumbered, Kale shouted. Then fight smarter. Aaron replied, her voice calm despite the chaos. Kale gritted his teeth, focusing his shots on the creatures closest to the ship. Aaron moved like a storm, her blade flashing as she cut down their attackers with lethal efficiency. Despite their efforts, the creatures kept coming. Kale's mind raced. He glanced toward the ship, an idea forming. Aaron, cover me. Without waiting for her response, he sprinted toward the ship's console. He activated the external defense grid, a relic of the Starseeker's glory days. The turret system sputtered to life, their targeting sensors locking onto the creatures. The clearing lit up as the turrets fired, beams of energy cutting through the darkness. The creatures scattered, their sleek forms disappearing into the shadows. Within moments, the clearing was silent again. Kale slumped against the console, his chest heaving. Aaron approached, her blade slick with dark, viscous blood. Not bad, she said, her voice grudgingly respectful. Not bad yourself, Kyle replied, though he knew she'd done most of the work. For the first time, Aaron's expression softened, if only slightly. Maybe you're not as useless as you look. Kale managed a tired grin. High praise. As the storm settled and the horizon lightened with the faint glow of dawn, Kyle felt a flicker of hope. They were far from safe, but for now, they had survived. The rebel station hung in the emptiness of space like a forgotten relic, its jagged structure a patchwork of salvage parts. Kyle guided the Starseeker toward its docking bay, his hands steady on the controls despite the ship's groaning. The station's dim lights flickered as if unsure of their purpose, a reflection of the desperation that clung to this hidden outpost. Aaron stood behind him, silent but watchful. Her amber eyes, fierce and unyielding, scanned the viewport. She'd said little since their encounter with the predators on the wasteland planet. Kyle could feel her presence like a coiled spring ready to snap. Doesn't look like much, she said finally. It's not, Kyle admitted, but Sarah Kalin runs it. If anyone can help, it's her. Aaron's lips curved into a faint smirk. You trust her? She hasn't shot me yet, Kyle said. That's the closest thing to trust out here. As the docking clamps secured the Starseeker, Aaron turned to face him. What happens if she doesn't help? Then we improvise, Kyle said, powering down the ship. He met her gaze, his tone firm. But we'll get what we need. We don't have another choice. The air inside the station was stale, carrying the metallic tang of recycled oxygen. The corridors were narrow, their walls patched with mismatched plating and exposed wiring. Kyle led the way, his boots echoing on the metal floor. Irene followed, her movements silent despite her size. She was a predator in unfamiliar territory, her every step calculated. They reached the command center, where a woman stood at the central console. Sarah Kalin was lean and sharp-featured, her dark hair streaked with gray. Her eyes flicked up as they entered, narrowing in recognition. "Kale Varen," she said, her voice dry, still alive. "That's disappointing." Kale spread his arms in mock greeting. "Always a pleasure, Sarah." Her gaze shifted to Aaron, lingering for a beat too long. "And who's this? A new partner? Or just another one of your messes?" "Aaron Thalora," Aaron said, stepping forward. Her voice was steady, her presence commanding, "and I'm nobody's mess." Sarah raised an eyebrow, her expression unimpressed. "Thalorin, huh? Guess that explains why you look like you're ready to kill someone. What are you doing with Kale?" Trying not to regret it, Aaron replied coolly. Kale sighed. "We're here because we need help. Repairs, supplies, and information. Can you deliver, or should we move on?" Sarah folded her arms, leaning against the console. "What's in it for me?" "Besides my eternal gratitude?" Kyle asked. "Don't push it," Sarah said, her tone sharp. She glanced at Aaron again. "The Celestium Alliance has a bounty out on you, doesn't it?" Aaron stiffened, her eyes narrowing. "What do you know about that?" Sarah shrugged. "Enough to know your trouble. And trouble tends to follow Kale like a shadow." Kale stepped between them, his voice firm. "We're not staying long. Just give us what we need, and we'll be out of your way." Sarah studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "Fine, but don't get comfortable. This place is barely holding together as it is." The repairs to the Starseeker began immediately. Aaron worked alongside the station's engineers, her strength invaluable in lifting heavy components and stabilizing the damaged landing gear. Kale focused on the navigation systems, recalibrating the ship's jump drive with a focus that bordered on obsessive. Despite their progress, tension hung thick in the air. Aaron kept to herself, her interactions with the station's crew curt and efficient. Kyle caught glimpses of her as she worked. Her jaw set, her eyes distant. She was a soldier without a war, a survivor struggling to find purpose. That night, Kyle found her in the cargo hold, staring out at the stars through a small viewport. She didn't turn as he approached. "You've been quiet," he said, leaning against the wall. "Not much to say," she replied. Kyle hesitated, then said, "You don't trust her." "I don't trust anyone," Aren said, her voice sharp. "Especially not someone who looks at me like I'm a weapon to be traded." "She's not going to sell you out," Kale said. "She's not that kind of person." "Maybe," Aaron said. She finally turned to face him, her amber eyes burning. "But you've been wrong." Kale didn't argue. She was right. He'd been wrong plenty of times, and the cost had always been high. Instead, he said, "You're not a weapon, Irene." "Not." Her expression softened, though only slightly. "Then what am I?" "A choice I made," Kale said, "and one I don't regret." The station's peace shattered the next morning. Kale was in the engine room when the alarms blared, a sharp, piercing sound that sent adrenaline coursing through his veins. He grabbed his comm and sprinted toward the command center, dodging panicked crew members. When he arrived, Sarah was already at the console, her face pale. "What's happening?" Kale demanded. "The Celestium Patrol," Sarah said, her voice tight. "They're scanning the sector. They'll find us if we don't move." Kale's stomach sank. "How long do we have?" "Minutes," Sarah said. She glanced at him, her eyes hard. "You brought this on us, Kale." Kale turned to see Aaron standing in the doorway, her expression grim. "What's the plan?" "We don't have one," Kale admitted. "Not yet." "Then make one," Aaron said, stepping closer. "Because if they find me, they'll burn this station to the..." Kyle's mind raced. The station wasn't equipped for a fight, and the Starseeker wasn't ready to fly. He needed a distraction, something to draw the Celestium Patrol away. "I'll take one of the shuttles," he said. "Lead them off your trail." That's suicide, Sarah said sharply. Got a better idea, Kyle snapped. Sarah hesitated, then cursed under her breath. Fine, but you're on your own. Not entirely, Erin said. She stepped forward, her stance resolute. I'm coming with you. Kale shook his head. You don't have to. I'm not hiding while you get yourself killed, Erin said firmly. We do this together. Kale didn't argue. He couldn't. The look in her eyes left no room for debate. The shuttle launched into the void, its engines humming steadily. Kyle piloted the craft with precision, his hand steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. Erin sat beside him, her gaze fixed on the sensor display. They're picking up the signal, she said. 2 ships breaking off to follow. Good, Kyle said. That's 2 fewer to worry about. The Celestum ships closed the distance quickly, their sleek designs built for speed and maneuverability. Kyle pushed the shuttle to its limits, weaving through the asteroid field that lay between them and open space. You're cutting it close, Erin said as the shuttle scraped past a jagged rock formation. Wouldn't be fun otherwise, Kyle replied, though his knuckles were white on the controls. The Celestum ships fired, their lasers slicing through the void. Kyle veered sharply, the shuttle shuddering as debris struck its hull. Erin grabbed the weapons controls, returning fire with measured precision. They're not letting up, she said. They don't have to, Kale said. We just need to keep them busy. The shuttle dove into a dense cluster of asteroids, the Celestum ships close behind. Kyle's focus narrowed, every movement calculated as he led their pursuers deeper into the field. The shuttle's engines strained, but Kyle pushed forward, his instincts honed by years of flying under pressure. Finally, the Celestum ships broke off, their sensors struggling to track the shuttle through the debris. Kyle exhaled sharply, his chest heaving. Nice flying, Erin said, her tone grudgingly approving. Nice shooting, Kale replied. They shared a brief look, a flicker of understanding passing between them. For the first time, Kyle felt like they were on the same side. And for the first time, he believed they might just stand a chance. The Starseeker burst from hyperspace, its hull trembling as it emerged into the graveyard sector. Here, the void was dense with the ruins of countless battles. Broken warships, scavenged freighters, and fragments of vessels long forgotten floated in eerie silence. Twisted steel and shattered hulls glinted faintly under the dim light of a pulsar. It was a graveyard in every sense, both for ships and the souls who had perished aboard them. Kale Varen gripped the controls tightly, weaving the ship through the labyrinth of debris. Each maneuver required precision. The sector was treacherous for even the most experienced pilots. Yet Kale's expression remained calm, his mind already focused on the task ahead. Lovely place, Erin said from the copilot's seat, her tone edged with sarcasm. She was scanning the endless field of wreckage with amber eyes, sharp and alert. You sure this is where we'll find your allies? They're not allies yet, Kyle said, his voice steady. But they're desperate, and desperation makes for good fighters. Erin raised an eyebrow. Desperation also makes for treachery. What's stopping them from gutting us and taking the Starseeker? Kale glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Me. She didn't return the smile. Instead, she leaned back, her gaze lingering on the massive wreckage ahead. A derelict cruiser half buried in drifting debris. The ship's hull was scarred, its insignia long erased by time and violence. Lights flickered sporadically, evidence of life aboard despite the cruiser's decrepit state. This the place? Erin asked. Kale nodded. That's the Peregrine. It's been home to scavengers, smugglers, and mercenaries for years. If anyone here is looking for a fight, we'll find them there. And if they're not looking for a fight, then we make them an offer. They can't refuse, Kyle said, his voice firm. They've all lost something to the Celestum Alliance. We just need to remind them of that. Erin snorted. I've heard worse plans. Kyle guided the Starseeker toward the cruiser, its docking bay opening like the maw of a beast. The moment the clamps secured the ship, Kyle rose from his seat, checking the blaster at his hip. Erin followed, adjusting the strap of her blade across. Stay sharp, Kyle said as they stepped into the airlock. These people don't trust easily. Good, Erin said, her voice low. Neither do I. The interior of the Peregrine was dim and claustrophobic, its corridors a maze of rusted walls and flickering lights. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burnt circuits and recycled oxygen. Every step echoed, a constant reminder of how fragile the cruiser was. Cale led the way, his movements cautious but confident. The mess hall was their destination, a wide, open chamber repurposed into a gathering place. When they entered, all conversation stopped. Roughly a dozen beings turned to stare, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Most were human, but a few were alien, species Kyle didn't recognize. The room buzzed with tension, the kind that could spark into violence at the slightest provocation. A wiry man with cybernetic arms stepped forward. His grin was sharp and humorless, his mechanical eyes glowing faintly. "Kyle Varen," he said, his voice carrying a metallic rasp. "Haven't seen you in years. Thought you were dead." Kyle met his gaze evenly. "Disappointed?" The man chuckled, the sound grating. "Not at all. Dead men don't pay their debts. So what brings you to the Peregrine? Looking to get yourself killed, or are you selling something?" "I'm here for fighters," Gareth Kyle said. "I've got a target that'll make the Alliance bleed. But I need a..." The room erupted into murmurs, some incredulous, others intrigued. Gareth raised a hand, silencing them. "Big words," he said, his tone skeptical. "But you're not exactly known for delivering on promises. What makes you think we'll follow you into suicide?" Cale pulled the data crystal from his pocket, holding it up for all to see. "Because I have this." The murmurs stopped. Gareth frowned, his mechanical fingers twitching. "And what's that supposed to be?" "Schematics," Cale said. "The location of a Celestum stronghold. It's heavily armed, but this crystal contains their weak points, security rotations, blind spots, even supply routes. With this, we can get in, take what we want." A scarred woman stepped forward, her face hard and unreadable. "What do you want with the stronghold?" "Prisoners," Kyle said. "The Alliance keeps high-value captives there. Resistance leaders, dissidents, anyone who stands against them. We free those people, and we weaken the Alliance's grip on the outer systems." "And what's in it for us?" the woman asked, her tone cold. "Revenge," Erin said, stepping forward. Her voice cut through the room like a blade. "Freedom. Whatever the Alliance took from you, this is your chance to take it back." The scarred woman eyed her, then turned back to Cale. "She speaks for you now." "She speaks for herself," Kyle said. "But she's right. The Alliance thrives because they keep us divided. If we stand together, we can hit them where it hurts." The room was silent for a moment, tension hanging thick in the air. Then Gareth laughed, a sharp, grating sound. "You've got guts, Cale. I'll give you that," he said. "But guts don't win wars." "No," Kyle said, "but they start them." By the time Cale and Erin returned to the Star Seeker, they had a crew, 6 recruits willing to fight, though Cale suspected more out of desperation than loyalty. Gareth and the scarred woman, Rhea, had taken leadership roles among them. Gareth brought his cybernetic enhancements and tactical expertise, while Rhea had a reputation for explosives and a burning hatred for the Alliance. The atmosphere aboard the Starseeker was tense as the new recruits settled in. Erin remained distant, her interactions curt and precise. Kyle worked tirelessly to integrate the stolen schematics into the ship's navigation systems, his focus. That night, Erin found him in the cockpit, staring at the pulsar outside. The faint light bathed his face in pale hues, making the lines of fatigue more pronounced. "You haven't slept," she said. Cale didn't look at her. "Neither have you." She leaned against the wall, crossing her arms. "You think this will work?" "I don't know," Cale admitted, "but it's better than doing nothing." Erin studied him for a moment, then said, "They're scared, all of them." "So am I," Kyle said quietly. He finally turned to face her, his expression grim. "But fear's not a bad thing. It keeps us alive." Erin nodded, though her gaze was distant. "And if we fail?" Cale smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Then we make sure they remember us." The Starseeker approached the stronghold under the cover of a massive freighter, its hull painted to blend into the asteroid field surrounding the base. The team was silent, their faces tense as Kale outlined the plan one last time. "Gareth, you're on the security systems," Kyle said. "Disable their scanners and buy us as much time as you can. Rhea, plant charges at the fuel reserves. We'll use the explosion as a distraction. Aaron, you're leading the assault team. Get the prisoner." "And you?" Aaron asked. Kale hesitated. "I'll hold them off." Aaron's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. The team nodded, their expressions resolute. They had nothing left to lose, and everything to fight for. As the Starseeker docked, Kyle's chest tightened. This was it. There was no turning back. He glanced at Aaron, her amber eyes burning with determination. "Let's make this count," he said. "We will," she replied. They step into the stronghold, their movements swift and silent. The corridors were cold and sterile, the air heavy with tension. Every step brought them closer to the heart of the base, and to the battle that awaited them. Kale gripped his blaster tightly, his resolve unshaken. They weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting for something greater. And this time, they wouldn't run. The Celestum stronghold loomed ahead, an imposing fortress carved into the side of a jagged asteroid. Its sharp, angular architecture made it appear more like a weapon than a structure, with walls bristling with automated turrets and sensor. The facility was a symbol of oppression, its defenses a silent warning. No one escaped, and no one dared to try. Inside the Starseeker, Kyle Varen adjusted the ship's trajectory with precision, guiding it closer to the stronghold's shadowed underbelly. The stolen schematics had revealed a small, seldom-used docking port near the maintenance bays, a blind spot in the fortress's otherwise airtight security. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. The silence in the cockpit was oppressive. The team sat strapped into their seats, their faces etched with grim determination. Gareth, his cybernetic hands flexing rhythmically as if preparing for a fight. Rhea, her scarred face expressionless but her fingers idly checking the detonator at her belt. And Aaron, who sat apart from the others, her amber eyes fixed on the viewport. Her stillness wasn't born of fear, but focus. She was already calculating, preparing for the storm. "We're in position," Kyle said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Everyone knows their role." A series of nods answered him. Gareth grinned faintly, the edge of confidence masking the strain in his synthetic voice. "Hack the systems, disable their eyes and ears. Easy." "Easy isn't the word I'd use," Rhea muttered. "If you mess up, I'm not waiting for you." "Don't worry," Gareth shot back. "I'll leave you a nice trail of breadcrumbs to follow." Aaron interrupted their bickering with a sharp glance. "Stay focused. We don't get second chances here." Kale turned to face the group. "Aaron's right. This isn't just about us. If we fail, the prisoners inside don't walk out. Remember why we're here." The words hung heavy in the air. Kyle held their gazes for a moment longer before turning back to the controls. "Docking in 30 seconds. Gear up." The docking bay was dark and eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the rest of the stronghold's imposing exterior. Kyle and the team moved swiftly, their footsteps muffled by the soft hum of the bay's environmental systems. The group split into their designated roles without hesitation. Gareth broke away first, crouching near a terminal embedded in the wall. His cybernetic fingers interfaced with the controls, wires snaking out from his wrist to connect to the panel. The faint glow of his augmented eyes reflected on the metal surface as he worked. "I'm in," Gareth whispered. "Disabling cameras and redirecting patrol routes. You've got a 10-minute window before they notice." "Make it 15, Rhea said, moving toward the junction where the maintenance bay fed into the rest of the facility. She carried a satchel of explosives, her movements efficient and deliberate. "I'll set the charges and meet you at the extraction point." Kale and Aaron exchanged a brief glance before heading toward the detention block. The corridor stretched ahead, its walls sterile and unwelcoming. They moved in tandem, their steps synchronized, their weapons drawn. "What's your plan if we hit resistance?" Aaron asked softly. Kale's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Improvise." "Not reassuring," she muttered. They reached the door to the detention block, its surface smooth and featureless save for a glowing keypad. Kyle tapped at the interface, the schematics fresh in his mind. The lock disengaged with a soft hiss, and the door slid open to reveal rows of cells stretching into the distance. Inside, the air was thick with the weight of despair. The cells were small, each one housing a single prisoner. Some captives lay motionless on narrow cots, while others stared at the newcomers with hollow eyes, their expressions a mix of fear and disbelief. "We're here to get you out," Kyle said, his voice firm but quiet. "Stay calm and follow our lead." One prisoner, a grizzled man with deep lines etched into his face, stepped forward. His voice was rough, but his eyes burned with defiance. "Who are friends?" Aaron said, stepping into the room. "And if you want to see the outside of this place again..." Kale moved to the control panel at the center of the block, his fingers flying across the interface. The locks on the cells disengaged one by one, the doors sliding open with a faint mechanical whir. The prisoners stepped out cautiously, their movements sluggish after years of confinement. As the last door opened, the alarms blared. Kyle barked into his comm. "What's going on?" "Must have tripped a secondary protocol," Gareth replied, his voice strained. "The system's fighting back harder than I expected. You've got incoming." "A lot of it." Erin turned to the prisoners, her voice sharp and commanding. "Move, now. Follow Kale to the extraction point." Kyle led the group into the corridor, their movements hurried but orderly. Erin stayed behind, her blade drawn, her stance steady as the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the halls. "They'll cut us off," Kale said, glancing back. "Then I'll keep them busy," Erin said, her tone unwavering. "You can't take them alone," Kyle argued. "I don't need to," she replied, her lips curling into a fierce smile. "I just need to slow them down." Kale hesitated, torn between staying and leaving. Erin's eyes softened, just for a moment. "Go, Kale. They need you." Reluctantly, Kyle nodded and turned away, his heart heavy. He led the prisoners toward the docking bay, his focus narrowing to the task at hand. Erin didn't wait long. The first wave of guards rounded the corner, their weapons raised. She moved before they could fire, her blade a blur of silver and violet. The fight was brutal and efficient. She struck with precision, each movement calculated to maximize damage. The guards fell one by one, but more kept coming. Sweat dripped down her temple, her breaths coming in sharp bursts. Her muscles burned, but she pushed forward, her mind focused on one thing: buying time. Kale and the prisoners reached the docking bay as Ria's explosives detonated. The blast rocked the facility, the shockwave rippling through the walls. The group stumbled but kept moving, their fear driving them forward. "Where's Erin?" Ria demanded as she joined them at the ship. "She's holding them off," Kyle said, his voice tight. "We don't leave without her." The comm crackled to life. "Kyle." Erin's voice came through, strained but steady. "Get them out. I'll find my way back." "You don't have time," Kyle said, his chest tightening. "I'm coming back for you." "No, you're not," she said firmly. "Get them to safety. That's an order." Kyle hesitated, his hand hovering over the ship's controls. The prisoners were aboard, the ship was ready, but leaving her behind felt like a betrayal. "Kale," Erin said, softer this time, "trust me." The words hit him harder than any order. With a heavy heart, he powered up the Starseeker and guided it out of the docking bay. The stronghold erupted behind them, the chain reaction from Ria's explosives tearing through its core. Kyle stared at the viewport, his hands trembling on the control. Then, through the smoke and fire, a small escape pod shot out, its trajectory wobbly but intact. Kale's heart leapt. "I've got her," he said, relief flooding his voice. The Starseeker adjusted course, pulling the pod into its hold. When the hatch opened, Erin stepped out, battered but alive. Her blade was gone, her armor scorched, but her eyes burned with the same fierce determination. "Told you I'd make it," she said, smirking despite the blood on her lips. Kale smiled, shaking his head. "You're impossible." "Damn right," she said, collapsing into a seat. The prisoners stared at her in awe, their gratitude palpable. For the first time in years, they had hope, and it was because of her. Kale looked at Erin, his respect for her deepening. Together, they had done the impossible. And though the war was far from over, this victory was a step toward something greater. Toward freedom.